Hey, Victor Guidera here from Recordeo, and in this lesson, I'm going to show you some really easy and effective ways to EQ your drum recordings. And this is for when you're just starting out, or if you have been working on recording drums for a while now. These are some of the core concepts that you may have missed or that you need to pick up right from the start. EQ is arguably the single most effective type of effects processing that we can do to improve the sound of your drums, whether that's the individual microphones, kick, snare, so on, or the drum kit as a whole, or different combinations together, EQing those combinations of microphones. This will have the largest impact on improving that sound. And so to demonstrate some of the concepts here today, I pulled the recording session that I just captured very recently with John Moffett up at Drumeo. And John Moffett was the veteran, longtime 30-year veteran drummer for Michael Jackson until he passed away. And he's also toured with, all of the other Jackson family and Elton John and Madonna and George Michael. The list goes on. It's a very, very reputable artist in this industry. John was an amazing person as well. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is cut versus boost. Now, if you look at a standard EQ here, you'll see that there's, I have some dips going on in this EQ. So that would be a cut. Pulling a portion of the sound of that microphone down, that would be a cut, and pulling it and boosting it up would be a boost. And so what I generally do with EQ is I cut a lot more than I'm boosting portions of the sound. So I essentially want to find a portion or multiple portions of the sound that I do not like, and then I want to minimize that a little bit and cut that out. And so, when I do that process with individual mics and the drum kit as a whole, that brings me to the sound that I'm looking for a lot faster than if I were to try to boost a lot of areas of the sound that I do like. So I definitely recommend starting out with that mentality first, cut more than boost. But of course, it's okay to boost certain portions of the sound that you do like. And the next core concept I want to talk about is the high pass filter. So what this is I have it again on the snare microphone here. As you can see, what's happening with the slope here, it is going to cut off all of the sound of that source, of that signal source microphone, we'll call it, from a certain point and everything below that. So as you can see, if I set it at 140 hertz, here's that point where there's 140 hertz, and it's going to slope downward and cut everything off at a certain rate, which is the slope, and nothing will exist in the sound, below that point. And so why do we do that? We do that to clean up, every single microphone that's recorded. We don't want to have that really low sub-range sound of that microphone capture in that sound source. Even on a bass drum microphone, I will still use a high pass filter, but I'll show you here, I'll just do something like a really steep curve, and I won't cut off a lot of the sub range of that microphone. Maybe I'll roll it off at about 40 hertz or so, or 50 hertz, depending on how much sub range of that bass drum microphone that I need in the source. So I have essentially a high pass filter on every single microphone track. Yes, even the bass drums. That might sound crazy, but maybe don't start out with a high pass on your bass mic if you're just starting to use EQs, because you could end up very easily cutting off too much of that bass end. Or if you feel comfortable with what I just mentioned, give it a shot. So first on the snare, I'm going to play back and start cutting off some of that sub range with a high pass and listening for portions of the sound that I don't like. And we actually in this recording had two top snare microphones, an Earthworks SR20 LS and a Shure SM57. Right now, let's just not worry about multiple mics. I'm just muting the 57 and we'll work on the Earthworks mic. Cool, so as you saw, I swept the high pass up until it cut off too much of the snare sound, and then I brought it back down, and I kind of wavered a little bit back up and forth, and found that midpoint where I'm not cutting off the fatness of the snare drum, because that's something you don't want to do as well. Of course, depending on the genre and the the overall mix of the song, maybe you do want more fatness or not. And so what I didn't like about the snare drum was just one pitch overtone that was ringing pretty strong. And so, to cut that, like I mentioned cutting, we're going to take one EQ point, boost it up quite a bit, 10, anywhere from 10 to up to 20 dB depending, and then we will sweep that frequency point across the spectrum, and we'll really hear what I'm listening for is what I really basically when it sounds the worst. When do I really not like it? But for this snare drum, I'm going to be really trying to pinpoint that actual pitch that I was talking about, and then we will cut that down. And that's essentially it for the boost, sweep, and cut, and then the sound will be that much better. So let's check it out. The difference is subtle when taking that EQ out and putting it back in, but when you do more of these cuts and surgical moves on your microphones together, listening to them in the whole mix as well. Of course, we also want to EQ not just soloed on an instrument, but with playing all of the tracks together. It will just be that much more glued together all the way across every single microphone. And of course, this drum recording, it requires that kind of work in detail on each of the microphones because there was a lot. It was a very large kit, a lot of microphones to capture all of those sounds with high fidelity and stuff. So now let's talk about what I did on the bass drum microphone. And again, there are multiple microphones on the bass drum. There's a 602 at the porthole and a AKG D112 inside of the bass drum, sort of my favorite combo, and a subkick Solomon mics low freak out on the reso head on the bass drum. So digging into the EQ here, we'll just talk about the 602, which is what I call the all-range bass drum mic at the porthole, pointed towards the bearing edge, meeting the bass drum head on the batter side. And it looks like we've done a sharp little cut right here at 87 hertz, which is an odd one. Let's check that out. I don't quite remember. And then a dip, a wide dip in the frequency spectrum over at 215 hertz in the low mid. And looks like I knocked down a tiny bit of the point at 5,300 hertz or 5.3 kilohertz, where the beater, that's kind of where the beater's smacking across the head, so maybe it was a little bit bright sounding. And then we roll off the very top end of the frequency spectrum. And if you choose to do that, then be very light or careful with that, or maybe not use what that is called a low pass filter. Maybe just try something like just a shelf that will bring down a little bit of that top end. And what I'm trying to do with that is bring down a little bit of the cymbals bleeding through into that bass drum mic. So let's just have a listen here, and I'll play with some of the EQ points. I'm really curious about that 87 hertz. Let's see what's going on there. Great. So what's happening there is just with the tuning and the muffling that he had going on in the drum, there is a buildup at that frequency point at 87 hertz. Where it was a little unpleasant and it was rumbling through. I remember it just sort of affected the overall drum mix as a whole, and that's why it's a sharp little narrow range of the frequency spectrum that it's affecting. Just a little cone that I'm dipping out just to try to pinpoint just that frequency point at 87 hertz. And as you could hear, when I pulled that down, it was much more pleasant. So then the low mid here at 215 hertz, that's just a little bit of mud in the signal. And let's just have a listen to that and boosting that back up and see what's happening there. Again, so the changes are very subtle, but when you make these subtle changes across all of the microphones, really they add up to a much higher fidelity drum mix as a whole. And so let's just listen to the whole thing bypassed and unbypassed. And the high pass filter. Now, I hope you have a subwoofer or really high quality headphones where they can go down to a really sub range, which isn't too common necessarily. But if I did not roll off at 43 hertz, what I'm hearing is like the lowest of low sub being captured by that Sennheiser 602 mic. And, keeping that in the mix, it'll just be crazy to have that really low sub range left over in the mix. It may, if somebody ever listens to your mix on, a system where they have a subwoofer, it may make it go a little crazy in that very low end. So essentially, I'm going to cut that off. But not too high up in the spectrum because we want the bass drum to still have a lot of low sub-range power to it. And for the toms, let's just talk about one of them, the 12-inch tom, and you're going to hear a really dramatic change with the massive amount of cutting that I'm doing here and a little bit of boost as well. And so there's just a little bit more overtones than I would normally want in a 12-inch tom. And so what I did is I found one point whether it was really abundant with the ring overtones in the tom, and I cut that down, and there was still more to come. So I started at the low end, the low mids first, and then I swept around with the highs or the actual mids, and then found another point. And then once I really scooped those, then it really sounded good. And then of course I wanted a bit more fidelity right on the root note of the drum, and I found where that was and boosted that up. So let's listen with before and after. And that is how powerful the boost, sweep, find what you don't like, and cut can really be for you, especially with a little bit wonkier tuning or overtones that are happening in your drums. Now with the overheads, really depending on the genre and the room and the placement of them and how many more microphones you had on the kit, you may want them to capture more warmth and more drum shells, or you may want that to have less. And so for this mix, I wanted just a sort of a medium balance. I want the close tom microphones and the snare and the bass to cover a lot of that low warmth from those close mics, and the overheads to really get a lot more of the ambience and cymbals, but still have a decent amount of, sort of shell sound, drum shell sound in them as well. So we're really not doing too much to the overheads. And again, there are multiple mics. Let's just focus on one EQ, and of course I will simply duplicate that EQ to each of the overheads or work on them at the same time depending on what your recording and mixing setup is. And so let's check out the left overhead only, and I've collapsed it to mono just so that we can get a nice full fidelity right in front of our face as we're EQing something. I do that actually when I EQ all of the instruments. Even if I'm only working on one, I monoize it or I pan it up the center so that I can hear very nice and equally just right in my face from both of the speakers. So as you can hear, it was just a little bit of that sort of cloudiness and build up at about 350, 400 hertz in the room with all of the instruments going on, all the voices, they really start to build up and add on one another. And it just sort of gets unclear in that range. So I just scooped out a bit at 360 hertz and did of course the high pass roll off with a lower slope, so it wasn't too steeply cutting off the low end at 112 hertz. And so that's pretty much all that really nice Earthworks SR25 microphone needed for EQ. So I'm not going to do much more than that. Maybe if you're using a cheaper lower end microphone, which I use a lot, maybe you have to dip out different parts of the spectrum, or maybe you need to get some more top end back into the thing and have the cymbals really shine and brightness of them shine through. And so you want to boost a little bit of the top end as well. And so that's it for all of the main microphones here. Let's have a listen to all of the mics together, full drum mix, and let's bypass the EQs and put them back in. And that should be a really dramatic effect to hear all of the microphones without their main EQs in, and then putting them back in for full fidelity. And so isn't it a massive difference that the EQ makes on the microphones? Putting it in, taking it out, putting it back in. It really cleans up the entire mix. Each shell and cymbal is really singing to its full fidelity. There's not any washiness, of any voices drowning out one another. Each of the shells are sounding really full fidelity and things like that. It's a lot more clear, and the drum performance is a lot more clear and crisp, and it just sounds better, right? And so, of course, there's a lot more we can do for the processing, compression and gates and editing and things like that. Not in this lesson, though. We do a lot of that. We go over all that kind of stuff in Recordeo.com and here on YouTube. So be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram, where we release all kinds of free lessons like this. And we're even talking some behind the scenes in recording studios and recording sessions and different scenarios and things like that. And check out Recordeo.com, where we have our awesome subscription service there and our wicked community of recording enthusiasts like yourself. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in some more lessons.